Franklin Pierce entered the world on a cold November day in 1804, in a modest farmhouse in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Snow lay heavy on the pines, the hearth burned low, and his father, Benjamin Pierce, a Revolutionary War veteran, watched the infant's breath rise in thin clouds. This boy, the fifth of 8 children, was born into the rugged soil of early America, where ambition was carved from hardship. His mother, Anna Kendrick Pierce, was quiet, pious, and firm, shaping in him a sense of duty that would follow him like a haunting echo. Even as a child, Franklin was restless. He loved the rolling fields and icy brooks, but longed for more than the simple life of a farmer's son. His father's tales of war and independence lit a fire in him, a yearning for purpose, recognition, and belonging. Yet the boy's path was anything but smooth. He struggled in his early schooling, distracted and unfocused. The story goes that when he left home for Bowdoin College in Maine, he wept by the roadside, homesick and uncertain, before steeling himself to continue. That was the first of many moments when despair would threaten to undo him, and when pride would drive him forward again. At Bowdoin, Pierce found his footing. He discovered books, ambition, and charm. He became class president, beloved by his peers, and surrounded himself with minds that would shape America's future. Nathaniel Hawthorne among them. His father, now a state governor, saw in him the promise of legacy. Franklin studied law, rising quickly through ranks of practice and politics. The small-town lawyer with the easy smile soon became the youngest member of the New Hampshire legislature. Every step forward, every handshake and speech carried him closer to a dream he could barely name. But even as success bloomed, something darker coiled beneath. The quiet melancholy of a man driven by ambition yet haunted by doubt. And that doubt would one day devour everything he loved. Franklin Pierce's climb into politics was swift and intoxicating. By his mid-20s, he had already become a member of the New Hampshire legislature, where his charm and eloquence made him a natural leader. He was tall, strikingly handsome, with soft, dark eyes and an effortless grace that drew admiration from allies and opponents alike. He didn't thunder in debate. He persuaded with warmth. Every gesture seemed born of sincerity, every word carefully measured to please. Beneath that polished surface, though, burned a hunger for validation, a need to prove he was more than the son of a war hero. By 1833, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, one of the youngest men ever to hold that seat. Washington dazzled him. The halls of Congress hummed with ambition, and Pierce thrived in that current. He loved the political theater, the alliances, the smoky tavern conversations, the late-night strategy sessions. Yet even as he rose, his heart remained tethered to New Hampshire, where a delicate and devout woman named Jane Means Appleton awaited him. Jane was everything Franklin was not, reserved, moral, almost fragile in her faith. Their marriage in 1834 united two worlds that rarely touched, his brash confidence and her quiet piety. She despised politics, fearing its corruption and vanity, while he could not live without it. Still, he adored her, even as he pursued a path that constantly pulled him from her side. As Pierce's political influence expanded, he earned a seat in the U.S. Senate by 1837. His speeches, though infrequent, carried weight. He championed states' rights and moderation, seeking unity in an era of deepening sectional divides. Then, in 1842, he did something few ambitious men would dare. He resigned. He claimed it was for his family, for peace, for principle. But the truth ran deeper. He was weary, haunted by disillusionment, and drawn to the bottle as both comfort and escape. For a time, Franklin Pierce disappeared from the political stage. But fate, relentless and cruel, was not finished with him yet. When the drums of war sounded in 1846, Franklin Pierce could no longer remain in quiet retirement. The Mexican-American War had erupted, and the nation's sons were called to arms. Though he was now a respected lawyer in Concord, the call of honor stirred something fierce in him. He saw in the war a chance not only to serve but to redeem himself, to silence whispers that he had fled from public life. Duty and pride joined hands, and he volunteered. President James K. Polk, recognizing Pierce's loyalty to the Democratic Party, commissioned him as a brigadier general. It was a political gesture, some said, but Franklin was determined to prove his worth. He traded his tailored suits for the rough wool of an officer's uniform and rode south with resolve glinting in his eyes. The man who once debated policy in marble halls now led soldiers through dust and heat under cannon fire and Mexican sun. The campaign was brutal. At the Battle of Contreras, Pierce's horse was struck and fell on him, pinning him to the ground and injuring his knee badly. Bloodied and in agony, he refused to quit the field, dragging himself forward to lead his men. His courage impressed those around him, but his physical collapse during later engagements earned him quiet ridicule. Some saw him as gallant, others whispered weakness. To Franklin, the truth didn't matter. He had gone to Mexico seeking vindication and left with scars instead, both visible and unseen. Jane met him with relief, though her fragile spirit recoiled from the man he had become, haunted, restless, and too often drunk. He tried to settle again into the quiet rhythms of law and family, but destiny had already begun to stir in the background, and soon the country itself would call him back to its center. By the early 1850s, Franklin Pierce had become a respected figure in New Hampshire, steady, courteous, quietly successful. He had no ambition for higher office, or so he claimed. Politics, after all, had brought him nothing but fatigue and loss. Jane despised it, and Franklin had promised her peace. Yet the Democratic Party, fractured and searching for a unifying figure, saw in him something rare, a northern man loyal to southern interests, charming enough to appeal to both sides. He was the perfect compromise in an age when compromise was collapsing. When the Democratic National Convention convened in Baltimore in 1852, Pierce's name was barely mentioned at first. The favorites, Cass, Buchanan, Douglas, dominated the ballots, but one by one the delegates found reasons to hesitate. Old grudges, regional rivalries, mistrust, they all festered, and then on the 35th ballot a surprising consensus began to form. Pierce of New Hampshire, they said, the man with no enemies. Franklin was at home when the news arrived. He was stunned, almost horrified. Jane wept when she heard it, praying it would not be true. But the tide of politics cannot be turned by tears. Reluctantly, Pierce accepted the nomination, aware that destiny had returned to claim him. His campaign was smooth, almost effortless. The Whigs, divided and fading, chose the aging war hero Winfield Scott, Pierce's former commander in Mexico. The irony was cruel, and Franklin knew it. The contest became one of personality, not policy, and Pierce's warmth, youth, and northern man of southern principles appeal carried the day. In November 1852, Franklin Pierce won by a landslide. At 48, he would become the youngest man ever elected president of the United States. The triumph should have been glorious, but fate had one more trial to deliver before he even reached Washington. Only weeks after his victory, the Pierces boarded a train for Boston. Somewhere near Andover, the car derailed and tumbled down an icy embankment. Franklin and Jane survived, but their 11-year-old son, Benny, was thrown from the wreckage and killed instantly. Franklin found him crushed and lifeless. He never truly recovered. The man who entered the White House did so with a broken heart. When Franklin Pierce took the oath of office on March 4, 1853, the nation saw a handsome, eloquent man of promise, but inside he was hollow. His wife, Jane, pale and grief-stricken, refused to attend the inauguration. The memory of their son's death clung to them like a ghost. Even Pierce's inaugural address reflected his torment. He spoke of unity, progress, and God's will, but every word carried the undertone of sorrow. He had entered the highest office in the land, yet it felt more like a tomb than a triumph. In the early months, his administration shimmered with potential. His cabinet, though fractious, was one of the most capable of the era. Jefferson Davis, future Confederate president, became Secretary of War. Caleb Cushing took Attorney General, and William L. Marcy, Secretary of State. Together, they aimed to expand the nation's reach, strengthen its institutions, and restore harmony. But harmony was impossible in a country already cracking at the seams. Pierce's political instincts, once keen, faltered under grief and alcohol. He sought solace in drink more often than in counsel, his nights long and restless. Jane withdrew entirely, convinced their son's death was divine punishment for Franklin's ambition. She spent her days in mourning black, writing letters to her lost boy, as the White House echoed with silence. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the fatal decision that defined his presidency. Designed by Senator Stephen Douglas, it repealed the Missouri Compromise, allowing new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. Pierce, loyal to his Southern allies, signed it into law. He believed it would calm sectional tensions. Instead, it ignited them. Bleeding Kansas erupted in violence. The North saw Pierce as a Southern puppet, the South as a hesitant friend. His popularity collapsed almost overnight. Abroad, his administration achieved success. The Gadsden Purchase expanded America's borders. But at home, blood soaked the prairies, and Pierce's name became a symbol of weakness and failure. Each passing month deepened his isolation. His charm had faded, his friends had drifted, and the bottle became his truest companion. The president who sought unity had instead unleashed the storm. By 1855, the nation Franklin Pierce had sworn to unite was breaking apart before his eyes. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had torn open old wounds, and no amount of eloquence could close them again. Newspapers branded him a traitor to the North. Abolitionists called him a coward, while Southern Democrats doubted his resolve. Everywhere he looked, allies vanished and anger grew. The man once celebrated for his charm now found himself abandoned in a political wilderness of his own making. Violence spread across Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in brutal skirmishes. Reports of massacres reached Washington, and Pierce's administration responded hesitantly, torn between enforcing law and preserving political balance. His critics accused him of standing idle while Americans killed each other. He defended himself, claiming he sought peace and legality. But no one wanted moderation anymore. The time for compromise was over, and he was a man built for compromise. Jane watched his decline with quiet despair. Their marriage, already strained by grief, sank into silence. She prayed constantly, believing divine judgment still hovered over them. Franklin, unable to bear her sorrow, often escaped to private dinners or long nights of solitude with whiskey. His eyes, once lively, grew dull. His speeches, once warm, became defensive and weary. When the Democratic Convention of 1856 arrived, Pierce still hoped for renomination. He believed his record, especially in foreign affairs, proved his worth. His administration had opened trade with Japan, strengthened relations in Latin America, and pursued expansion through the Gadsden Purchase. But none of it mattered. The nation saw only Kansas, division, and blood. On the first ballot, delegates turned instead to James Buchanan, a man of steadier temperament and fewer enemies. Yet beneath the ashes of defeat, he felt something almost like relief. The burden was gone. The presidency had taken his reputation, his confidence, and nearly his soul. But at least it could take no more. His fall from power would not end his suffering. It would only begin another descent. When Franklin Pierce left Washington in March 1857, the cheers of victory were long gone. He returned to New Hampshire not as a celebrated statesman, but as a man the nation preferred to forget. The train stations were quiet, the handshakes fewer, and the newspaper headlines cruel. Once his charm had opened every door. Now his name was whispered as a cautionary tale. He withdrew to his home in Concord, surrounded by silence and the weight of memory. He tried to return to law, but the fire that once fueled him was gone. Clients came out of respect, not confidence. Jane's health, already frail, deteriorated further. Her faith deepened into obsession, her life revolving around prayer, solitude, and letters to their dead son. Franklin, unable to heal her sorrow or his own, turned increasingly to drink. The bottle that had once numbed his pain now became his only steady companion. He did not seek public office again, but controversy found him. In 1863, word of his private letters, critical of Abraham Lincoln and sympathetic to the Confederacy, leaked to the press. Angry mobs gathered outside his home, demanding explanations. Pierce stood firm, declaring his loyalty to the Union, but the damage was done. Whatever remained of his reputation disintegrated under the weight of war and mistrust. When Jane died in 1863, the last fragile bond that tethered him to hope snapped. He followed her coffin through the rain, pale and trembling, and afterward retreated into almost complete solitude. His once brilliant eyes grew glassy, his voice slurred from years of drink. He wandered the streets of Concord at dusk, a ghost among neighbors who pitied him. To many, he was the forgotten president, an artifact of a failed age. But even in his decline, Franklin Pierce could not escape history's gaze. As the Civil War raged on and the Union trembled, Franklin Pierce faded quietly into the background of American life. His days were long and slow, filled with reflection, isolation, and whiskey. The man who once commanded armies and addressed the nation now spent his mornings staring through the window of his modest home. The streets empty, the echoes of power long gone. He had outlived his time, and he knew it. When the Civil War ended, Pierce did not rejoice. The Union had survived, but at a cost he could scarcely bear to contemplate. He opposed slavery's spread, yet he loathed abolitionism. He loved the Union, yet sympathized with the South. His contradictions, once political, had become personal torment. The country had moved forward, and he remained behind, a relic of indecision and grief. Rumors persisted that he drank himself into stupors nightly. The truth was not far off. He had no wife, no children, and no role to play. Still, there were moments when the old Pierce flickered through, a flash of wit at a dinner table, a measured opinion shared with an admirer, a tender word for a struggling neighbor. But they were brief, like sparks in ash. By the 1870s, his health deteriorated rapidly. His liver failed, his strength ebbed, and his face, once bright and confident, sagged with time and sorrow. The newspapers barely mentioned him anymore. When they did, it was as a footnote, a forgotten president, a failed leader, a tragic man. In his final summer, he took long walks by the Merrimack River, moving slowly, quietly, like a man making peace with ghosts. He spoke little, drank much, and waited. The last act of Franklin Pierce's life was a quiet surrender. Autumn came to New Hampshire in 1869 with the scent of rain and dying leaves. Franklin Pierce, once the youngest president in American history, now moved through his days like a shadow. His body was frail, his mind haunted by memories of what had been and what could never be. He lived alone in a quiet house, overlooking the same hills where he had played as a boy, the same fields his father had once ploughed. In that return to simplicity, there was both peace and punishment. Neighbors saw him walking the streets of Concord at dusk, leaning heavily on his cane. Sometimes he paused at the churchyard where Jane and Benny were buried, whispering words no one could hear. To some, he was a pitiable drunk. To others, a tragic reminder that ambition often devours those who chase it too far. He had wealth enough to live comfortably, but comfort never found him. The laughter and applause of politics were replaced by silence, and in that silence the echo of regret never stopped speaking. By 1869, his health had collapsed entirely. The years of drinking and despair had taken their toll. His doctor described cirrhosis of the liver, a body slowly giving out. On October 8, 1869, at the age of 64, Franklin Pierce died quietly in his home. There were no great parades, no crowds of mourners. Only a few friends and neighbors gathered to see him laid beside his beloved Jane and Benny in Old North Cemetery. The rain fell gently that day, as though the heavens themselves were tired of judgment. And so Franklin Pierce was remembered not for what he built, but for how quietly he fell.